Mafia boss heard a stranger pray in Sicilian. It was his family's prayer. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Antonio Romano sat in his office high above the city, looking out at the twinkling lights of Manhattan. The city never slept, and neither did he. As the head of one of the most powerful mafia families in New York, he had little time for rest. He had spent years building his empire, making sure every deal was in his favor, every rival eliminated, every threat neutralized. But tonight, something felt different. Antonio's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his right-hand man, Vito. Someone wants to meet you. He says he has something important to discuss. Antonio didn't need to ask who it was. He already had an idea. He'd been getting whispers for days about a man who had been asking about him, a stranger who seemed to know far too much about the Romano family. Antonio wasn't one to entertain meetings with unknown figures, but this felt like something he couldn't ignore. Without a word, he grabbed his coat and walked out of his office, his footsteps echoing down the marble halls. The meeting place was a small, nondescript restaurant in Little Italy, the kind that was always busy with locals but never seemed to make much noise. Antonio arrived and was led to a private booth in the back. The man sitting there wasn't who he expected. He wasn't a rival gangster or a businessman trying to make a deal. Instead, he was a middle-aged man with a tired, weathered face, wearing a long coat that seemed too big for him. He looked out of place in the dimly lit restaurant, like a ghost from the past. The man stood up as Antonio approached, his hand trembling slightly as he extended it. "You don't know me," the man said, his voice soft but steady. "But I know your family, and I know the secret you've been trying to hide." Antonio's eyes narrowed. He was used to people trying to leverage his name, but there was something different about this man. He could feel the weight of his words before he even spoke them. "What are you talking about?" Antonio asked, his tone low, dangerous. The man took a deep breath, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Then he spoke again, his words hitting Antonio like a punch to the gut. "I know the prayer. The one your family has been saying for generations. The prayer your father taught you when you were a boy. I've heard it, and I know who taught it to you." Antonio's heart skipped a beat. His father's prayer. A secret his family had kept hidden for decades. A prayer passed down through the generations, one that no outsider should ever know. It was more than just a prayer. It was a symbol of everything his family stood for. Antonio took a step back, his mind racing. How could this man possibly know that prayer? How could he have heard it? The man's eyes were steady, unwavering, as he continued. "It's time for you to face the past, Antonio. The family you think you know is not the one you've been raised with. The truth is buried deep, and it's time for you to dig it up." Antonio didn't speak. His mind was reeling, but he knew one thing for certain. This man knew something he shouldn't. Something that could destroy everything he had worked for. The stranger's voice was low and urgent. "Your family's prayer is more than just words. It's a curse, a bond that has tied you to something much darker than you can imagine. You've been living a lie, Antonio, and now it's time to uncover the truth." Antonio stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. The walls seemed to close in around him as the man's words echoed in his mind. What was he talking about? What truth could possibly be hidden in the prayer his father had taught him? And why was this stranger so insistent on revealing it? Antonio didn't know what to think, but one thing was clear. His life was about to change forever. Antonio was still processing the stranger's words as he sat in the back of his black SUV, the city lights reflecting off the glass windows. He wasn't sure what to think. The man had left him with a single, cryptic sentence. "The truth is buried deep, and it's time for you to dig it up." It was a threat or a warning, but either way, it had rattled Antonio. He wasn't someone who got easily shaken. He had built his empire from the ground up, dealt with his enemies, and survived countless attempts on his life. But this was different. The prayer. The family's prayer. His father's prayer. He had heard it countless times as a child, recited by his father before every important decision, every risky move. But no one outside the family knew it. No one. Antonio had kept it a secret, a symbol of his family's power and influence. And now, here was a stranger, someone with no ties to the family, saying that he had heard it, that he knew the truth behind it. Antonio's thoughts were interrupted when the car came to a halt in front of a small, discreet building in the heart of the city. It was an old, rundown place, one of those that people passed by without giving it a second glance. But to Antonio, it was familiar. Too familiar. The memories of his past flooded his mind, memories he had long buried. His father had brought him here once, many years ago, when Antonio was just a boy. It had been a place of secrets, a place where deals were made and lives were lost. Antonio stepped out of the SUV and walked toward the building. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and damp concrete, and the silence felt heavy. He knew this was no coincidence. The stranger had led him here for a reason. He walked into the building, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Inside, the walls were lined with old photos, faded memories of a time when the Romano family ruled the streets of New York. The place was a memorial of sorts, a shrine to everything the family had built. At the back of the room, a man was waiting for him. He was tall, with dark hair that was beginning to gray at the temples. His face was weathered, but there was an air of power about him that Antonio couldn't ignore. The man stood with his back to Antonio, staring at a photograph on the wall. It was a picture of Antonio's father, smiling beside a group of men that Antonio didn't recognize. But there was something about the photograph that unsettled him. The man turned around slowly, his eyes locking with Antonio's. "I knew your father," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I knew him before he became the man you know today." Antonio felt his stomach tighten. He had heard stories of his father's past, stories he wasn't supposed to know, stories of betrayal, secrets, and things done in the shadows to protect the family's reputation. But this man, this stranger, seemed to know more than anyone else. "What do you know about him?" Antonio asked, his voice steady but with an edge of suspicion. The man smiled, a grim, knowing smile. "I know that the family's power didn't come from hard work or luck. It came from something much darker, something your father never told you about." Antonio took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're lying," he said, his tone sharp. "My father would never hide anything from me." The man's expression hardened. "Oh, he did. And you're about to find out exactly what it was." The stranger turned and walked toward a wooden desk, pulling out a small, worn book from the drawer. He placed it on the desk and pushed it toward Antonio. The book was old, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. Antonio hesitated for a moment before picking it up. As soon as he opened the cover, his eyes fell on the first page, where a familiar name was written in faded ink, Romano, his father's name. And beneath it, a list of names, people Antonio didn't recognize. But there was one name that stood out. It was his own. Antonio quickly turned the page, and the more he read, the more his heart began to race. This wasn't just any family history. This was something much darker. It was a record of deals, of betrayals, of people who had been used and discarded for the sake of the family's survival. His father had done things Antonio could never have imagined. "This is your legacy, Antonio," the man said, his voice heavy with meaning. "This is the truth your father tried to bury." Antonio felt a wave of anger and confusion wash over him. He had always believed in the family's honor, in the values his father had taught him. But now, as he read the words on the pages, he realized that everything he had been taught was a lie. His father had made deals with people who had no conscience, people who had no regard for human life. And now, it was all coming back to haunt him. "Why are you showing me this?" Antonio asked, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and fury. The man stepped closer, his face shadowed in the dim light. "Because it's time you took your place, Antonio. It's time you learned the truth. The family needs you. But first, you need to know who you really are." Antonio closed the book, his hands shaking. He didn't know what to believe anymore. All his life, he had been told that family meant everything. But now, the very foundation of that belief was crumbling before his eyes. He had to know more. He had to find out the full story. But one thing was clear. The truth would come at a cost. And Antonio wasn't sure if he was ready to pay it. Antonio Romano stood in the dimly lit room, the book still clutched tightly in his hands. The weight of the truth he had just uncovered pressed heavily on his chest, the words on the page spinning in his mind. His father, the man he had always looked up to, had made deals, formed alliances, and betrayed people in the name of power, money, and survival. The family that had raised him with a sense of honor and duty was built on a foundation of lies. Antonio ran his fingers over the pages of the book, feeling the history, the deals, the faces of people long gone, but whose actions still lingered in the shadows of his family's empire. The names in the book weren't just random. They were connected to every deal his father had made to establish the Romano family as a force to be reckoned with. But the more Antonio read, the more he realized that the cost of that power had been far greater than he could have ever imagined. He slammed the book shut, a sense of frustration boiling within him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the entire family, the legacy his father had left behind, and the future that Antonio now had to face. The stranger who had shown him this truth had only scratched the surface. Antonio needed more answers, and he needed them now. Without a second thought, he picked up his phone and dialed Vito's number. "Get over to the estate," Antonio said, his voice sharp. "I need answers, and I need them fast." Vito, his trusted right-hand man, arrived within the hour. Antonio had already gathered the key players from the family, everyone who needed to be in the know. He couldn't keep this secret any longer. His father's actions had set the stage for a chain of events that could either save the family or destroy it. Vito stepped into the room, his face a mix of concern and curiosity. "What's going on, boss?" Antonio didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We've been living a lie, Vito. Everything we've built, everything we've fought for, it's all based on a lie." Vito's brow furrowed as he looked at Antonio, but he remained silent. "You remember the prayer, right? The one my father taught me when I was a kid. The one that's been passed down through the generations?" Antonio asked, his eyes searching Vito's face for some sign of recognition. Vito nodded slowly. "Yeah, I remember. It's not something you forget. But what does that have to do with this?" Antonio's grip tightened on the book. "Everything, Vito. It has everything to do with this. The prayer, my father's prayer, isn't just some family tradition. It's a bond, a deal, a blood oath that ties us to something far darker than we've ever realized. My father made deals with people, dangerous people. And now, it's all coming back to haunt us." Vito stood still, processing Antonio's words. He had known Antonio's father was ruthless, but this was different. This was something he had never anticipated. "Who's behind all of this?" Vito asked, his voice low. Antonio turned the book toward him. "His name is Victor Petrov. He's been in the shadows for years, pulling the strings and using our family as pawns in his game. My father made a deal with him, one that should have never been made. And now, Petrov wants everything my family has built." Vito's eyes widened. Petrov was one of the most feared men in the criminal world. A man who controlled everything from weapons to illegal trade routes. A man who could destroy anyone who crossed him. And Antonio's father had made a deal with him. Antonio leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation sinking in. "We have to act fast," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. "Petrov's men are already moving against us, and we're sitting on a ticking time bomb. If we don't deal with this now, everything we've worked for is gone." Vito nodded, his expression hardening. "What's the plan?" Antonio stood up, his eyes hard with determination. "We go to war, Vito. We take the fight to Petrov and his people before they can make their move. We protect the family, and we eliminate anyone who stands in our way." The room fell silent as the weight of Antonio's words hung in the air. This wasn't just about power anymore. This was about survival. Antonio knew that in order to protect his family, he would have to sacrifice everything. He would have to make the kind of choices that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But that was the price of power. Vito finally spoke, his voice steady. "We're with you, boss. Whatever it takes." Antonio nodded, his mind already racing with plans. The game had changed, and he had no intention of losing. The family's future depended on him, and he would do whatever it took to secure it. The fight against Petrov had begun, and Antonio was ready to lead the charge. As Vito left to rally the men, Antonio couldn't help but think about the man who had brought all of this to light. The stranger who had revealed the truth about his family. Antonio didn't trust him, but he couldn't deny that the man had been right about one thing. The truth had been buried deep, and it was time for Antonio to dig it up. Antonio sat in his office late into the night, the weight of the world pressing down on him. The truth about his father's secret dealings with Victor Petrov had rocked him to his core. Everything he thought he knew about his family, about the legacy of the Romano name, was suddenly in question. The more he thought about the mysterious man who had shown him the old book, the more Antonio realized that this wasn't just about his family anymore. This was about his very identity. Who was he really? Was he the product of his father's choices, or was there something more to his story? The question gnawed at him, and Antonio couldn't shake the feeling that the answers he was searching for lay deeper than just his father's past. He had to confront the truth head-on. As he sat in the dim light of his office, the phone buzzed. It was Vito. "Boss, we've got movement. Petrov's men are closing in on our territory. They're making their move. You need to come quick." Antonio cursed under his breath. He had hoped for more time, but Petrov wasn't the type of man to waste opportunities. He was relentless, and now Antonio had to be as well. He grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the office, the doors slamming shut behind him. Vito was waiting outside, already in the car. The drive to the family's safe house felt like it took hours, though it was only a few miles. Antonio's mind raced. He couldn't let Petrov take control. The stakes were too high now. He had to take the fight to Petrov before it was too late. As they pulled up to the safe house, Antonio noticed something different about the air tonight. It was thick with tension, the kind that only came when everything was on the line. Inside, his men were already gathered, each one ready for the coming battle. They knew the risks, but they also knew that the Romano family didn't back down. Antonio entered the room and scanned the faces of his trusted lieutenants. Vito, his right-hand man, stood by the door, his face a mask of calm determination. "What's the situation?" Antonio asked, his voice cold and measured. Vito nodded, his eyes sharp. "We've intercepted some intel. Petrov's men are mobilizing, and they're aiming to hit us hard. We're expecting an ambush at the docks in a few hours." Antonio clenched his jaw. The docks were one of their most important territories. Losing it would be a major blow. "Get the men ready," Antonio ordered. "We strike first. We don't wait for them to come to us." The men nodded in unison, their expressions hardening with resolve. Antonio could see the loyalty in their eyes, the same loyalty he had built this empire on. But now, that loyalty was being tested. The battle for the family's survival was about to begin. As the team prepared for the confrontation, Antonio couldn't help but think back to the stranger's words. "The truth is buried deep, Antonio. It's time for you to dig it up." What did the man mean by that? And what was the truth that Antonio still had yet to uncover? Antonio had always believed that power came from control. But now, as he stood in the midst of a war with Petrov, he realized that power wasn't just about control. It was about knowing when to fight and when to let go. He had a feeling that the fight for his family's future wasn't just going to be won with bullets and blood. There was more to this game than he could see. As they made their way to the docks, the tension grew. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the city. Antonio's mind kept returning to the book, to the prayer, and to the stranger. What was the connection between his family's past and the present danger they faced? The closer they got to the docks, the more Antonio could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about defending his family's empire. This was about uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. When they arrived at the docks, Antonio's heart was pounding in his chest. The area was dark, shrouded in shadows. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and Antonio knew that Petrov's men would be ready to strike. But they wouldn't be ready for what was coming next. Antonio motioned for his men to spread out, taking cover behind the crates and shipping containers that lined the dock. The tension was thick in the air, each man poised and ready for action. Antonio could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had been in countless fights, but this felt different. It felt personal. As the minutes ticked by, Antonio's mind was sharp, scanning the area for any sign of movement. Then, without warning, the first shot rang out, followed by a volley of gunfire. The battle had begun. Antonio and his men returned fire, taking out Petrov's men one by one. The chaos of the firefight filled the air, the sound of gunshots echoing through the night. Antonio moved with calculated precision, his training kicking in. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for answers. The truth was out there, and tonight he would find it. The battle raged on, and Antonio pushed forward, determined to win. But as the last of Petrov's men fell, Antonio's eyes caught sight of something in the distance. A figure standing alone near the edge of the dock. It was the stranger, the man who had shown him the truth. He was watching, his eyes unreadable, his presence an enigma. Antonio felt a chill run down his spine. Why was the man here? What did he want now? Antonio started walking toward the stranger, his steps slow and deliberate. The man didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood there, waiting. What do you want? Antonio demanded, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. The stranger's lips curved into a faint smile. I told you, Antonio. The truth is buried deep. And now, you're finally ready to dig it up. Antonio stood still, staring at the stranger who had reappeared after the chaos at the docks. The man's calm demeanor in the middle of the battlefield felt out of place, like he was a ghost haunting the edges of Antonio's life. Antonio had seen his enemies fall, watched the blood spill, but this man, this figure standing in front of him, was something else entirely. The way he looked at Antonio was unnerving, as if he could see through him, as if he knew every secret Antonio had ever tried to bury. What do you want? Antonio demanded again, his voice hard. The man's faint smile deepened, but he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if studying Antonio more closely, reading him like an open book. You've fought for your family's name, Antonio. The stranger finally spoke, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. But that name, that power, it's not what you think it is. It's built on blood. Your father's blood, your grandfather's blood, and the blood of countless others who have died to protect a lie. Antonio's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The words hit harder than any bullet. The idea that his family's legacy was a lie, a fabrication built on the suffering of others, shook him to his core. His father had taught him that family was everything, that blood was sacred. But now, this stranger was unraveling it all. I don't believe you, Antonio said through gritted teeth, though doubt began to creep into his thoughts. The man's eyes narrowed. You don't have to believe me. But the truth is coming for you, Antonio. And it's already too late to turn back. Your father made a deal with Petrov, a deal that not only ties your family to him, but to something far darker. Something you were never supposed to know. Antonio felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected that Petrov's reach was deeper than he had originally thought. But this was something else entirely. He took a step forward, his eyes burning with anger. What do you want from me? He demanded, his voice low and threatening. The stranger didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He handed it to Antonio, and Antonio's breath caught in his throat when he saw the image. It was a picture of his father, young and smiling, standing with a group of men Antonio didn't recognize. But there was one person in the background, a woman, with dark eyes that seemed to stare right through the lens. She looked strangely familiar, though Antonio couldn't place her. Who is this? Antonio asked, his voice tight. Her name is Sofia Romano, the man replied. She was your father's first love, and she was killed because she knew too much about the deals he was making. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Antonio had never heard of a Sofia Romano, never been told that his father had a life before his mother. But this was no coincidence. The woman in the photograph, her dark eyes, her presence, felt like a puzzle piece that was finally falling into place. Your father's past is more complicated than you know, the stranger continued. He made enemies, yes, but he also made deals with people like Petrov to protect the family. He was willing to sacrifice anything, anyone, to keep that power. And Sofia was one of the first sacrifices. Antonio's mind raced. His father had kept so many secrets, and now it was clear that those secrets were buried deeper than he could have ever imagined. And what do you want me to do with this? Antonio's voice was barely above a whisper. The man's smile faded. You have a choice, Antonio. You can keep living in the shadow of your father's sins, continuing the legacy he built with lies and blood. Or you can confront the truth, even if it means tearing everything down. Petrov's hold on your family is tightening, and the truth about Sofia, about your father, will set you free. Antonio clenched his jaw, struggling to process everything the stranger had just told him. He had always believed that his father was a man of honor, a man who did what he had to do for the family. But now, he saw that the price of that power was higher than he could ever have imagined. His father's choices, his father's sacrifices, had created a legacy built on bloodshed and betrayal. What happens now? Antonio asked, his voice steady but with a note of uncertainty. The stranger's eyes flickered with something like approval. Now, Antonio, you make the choice. You decide what kind of man you want to be. But remember this, the truth is already on its way. It's only a matter of time before it finds you. And when it does, you'll have to face the consequences of your family's actions. Antonio stood in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had always believed in protecting the family, but now, the very foundation of that belief was shaking. He had to decide what mattered more, the legacy his father had built, or the truth that could destroy it. The stranger turned to leave, his figure disappearing into the shadows. You know where to find me when you're ready to face it, he said, his voice fading as he walked away. Antonio stood there, the photograph still in his hand, staring at the woman he had never known but somehow recognized. His world had changed in a single night, and now, he had to decide which path to take. The truth had been buried for so long, but now it was rising to the surface. And Antonio was about to confront it, no matter what the cost. Antonio spent the next few days in a haze, his mind overwhelmed by the weight of the decisions he had to make. The photograph of Sofia Romano, the woman who had never been a part of his life, now lingered in his thoughts, a constant reminder that his father's past was more complicated than he had ever realized. The man's words echoed in his mind. The truth is already on its way. Antonio wasn't sure if he was ready to face the truth, but one thing was clear, he couldn't keep running from it. The stranger had given him a choice, a chance to decide what kind of man he would be. Would he continue the legacy his father had built, or would he tear it all down to uncover the dark secrets that lay beneath? But Antonio couldn't do it alone. He needed to find out more about his father's past, and he needed answers from the only people who could provide them, his family. That night, Antonio called for a family meeting. The Romano estate was quiet, but the air inside felt heavy with anticipation. One by one, the family members gathered in the grand dining room, each with their own thoughts, their own suspicions. Antonio stood at the head of the table, the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. He looked around at the faces of his family, his uncles, his cousins, his brothers. These were the people he had trusted all his life. But now he wasn't so sure. "We need to talk," Antonio said, his voice steady, though he could feel the tension in the room. "It's time to face the truth. There are things about our family's past that we can't ignore any longer." His cousin Luca, a man known for his sharp tongue and quick temper, scoffed. "What's this about, Antonio? Another one of your little power plays?" Antonio's eyes narrowed, but he didn't rise to the bait. "This isn't about power, Luca. This is about our legacy, about everything we've built, and everything we've lost." Antonio's words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. The silence in the room deepened, and Antonio could feel the eyes of his family on him, waiting for him to explain. "What do you mean?" his uncle Matteo asked, his voice low, careful. Antonio took a deep breath and reached for the photograph of Sofia Romano. He placed it in the center of the table, watching as his family members leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. "This woman," Antonio began, his voice tight, "was my father's first love. She was killed because she knew too much. Too much about the deals my father made with Victor Petrov. Deals that should have never happened." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled in. His family knew Petrov's name, but they had always believed that their association with him was necessary, strategic, even. But now Antonio was telling them that it went much deeper than they had ever known. "Petrov was never just a business partner," Antonio continued. "He was someone my father made a pact with. And now, because of that pact, we're all in danger. Petrov's men are coming for us, and we can't just wait for them to strike." His cousin Marco, a man who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "What do you want us to do, Antonio? You're saying we're responsible for this mess?" Antonio's eyes met his expression hard. "No, Marco. I'm saying we're responsible for fixing it. Our family's name is built on blood, but it doesn't have to end in bloodshed. We can take control of this situation if we stand together." For a moment, no one spoke. Antonio could see the wheels turning in their minds, weighing the risks, calculating the consequences. Finally, his uncle Matteo spoke again. "You're asking us to go after Petrov, to tear down everything my brother built." Antonio shook his head. "I'm not asking you to tear down anything, uncle. I'm asking you to rebuild, to make things right. The family has always been built on power and loyalty, but it's time we built it on the truth. If we want to survive this, we have to confront the past." His uncle's eyes softened, a hint of sadness in them. I never thought it would come to this. Your father always wanted to protect you from the ugliness of his world. But it's clear now that the world we live in, the world your father created, isn't going to let us forget. Antonio's heart sank. His father had tried so hard to shield him from this, to protect him from the weight of the family's sins. But now, that protection was gone. And Antonio had to face the truth, whether he was ready or not. We strike at dawn, Antonio said, his voice steady. We go to Petrov, we confront him, and we take back what's ours. But we do it with the truth. We do it as a family. The meeting ended, but Antonio knew that the real battle was just beginning. As he walked back to his office, his thoughts were a whirlwind of strategy and fear. He had no idea what the next few days would bring, but one thing was certain. Everything he had known was about to change. He had to be ready to fight, not just for his family's empire, but for the truth that had been buried for so long. The battle with Petrov was only the beginning. The real war would be the one Antonio would have to fight within himself. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and preparation. Antonio's mind was constantly racing, caught between the looming battle with Petrov and the deeper, more troubling questions that had been raised about his family's past. The meeting with his family had been necessary, but it had only scratched the surface of what he needed to know. The revelation that his father's legacy was built on secrets, lies, and bloodshed haunted him every waking moment. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something huge, something that could change everything he knew. As dawn broke on the day they planned to confront Petrov, Antonio gathered his men. The Romano family estate was quiet, but Antonio's mind was anything but. He stood in front of his assembled team, his closest allies, all ready to go to war. Vito, Marco, Luca, and the others were there, their faces grim but determined. This is it, Antonio said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. Today, we take control of our destiny. We don't let Petrov decide our future. We take the fight to him. The men nodded, their expressions hardening. Antonio had always known that loyalty ran deep within his family, but today, it felt more important than ever. This wasn't just a battle for power, it was a battle for their survival and for the truth. As they drove toward Petrov's compound, the city seemed to hold its breath. Antonio had always been able to control his emotions, but today, he felt a surge of something he hadn't expected, doubt. What if Petrov was ready for them? What if they were walking into a trap? What if, in trying to protect his family, Antonio was only digging them deeper into the hole his father had created? The compound came into view, a sprawling estate surrounded by high walls and guarded gates. It looked like a fortress, an impenetrable stronghold. Antonio's stomach tightened. This was it. He wasn't just facing Petrov. He was facing everything his father had done, everything his family had become. The car slowed as they approached the gates, but before they could make their move, a black SUV pulled up behind them, blocking the road. Antonio's heart skipped a beat. It was too late to turn back now. They were already here, and they were already being watched. The doors of the SUV opened, and two men stepped out, their suits sharp and their eyes cold. They were Petrov's men, and they weren't here to negotiate. Without a word, Antonio and his team stepped out of their cars, taking their positions. The tension in the air was thick, and Antonio could feel his pulse quicken. This wasn't going to be easy. You've come all this way, Antonio, one of the men said, his voice low and menacing. But you should know, you're already too late. Petrov's plans are already in motion. There's nothing you can do to stop it. Antonio's gaze narrowed. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to take back what's ours. The man smirked, but there was no humor in his expression. You think you're the one in control? You think you have the power to take down someone like Petrov? You're just a child, playing in a world you don't understand. Antonio's temper flared, but he held it in check. This was no time to lose control. He had to think, to act with precision. I've come to end this, Antonio said, his voice cold as ice. I've come to end you. The man took a step forward, his hand resting on the gun at his side. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Petrov will destroy everything you've worked for. He's too powerful, too connected. Antonio's eyes flickered with a cold fire. I've already lost everything, he said, his voice sharp. What's left to lose? Without warning, Antonio's men sprang into action, taking down Petrov's men with swift, practiced precision. The sound of gunfire filled the air, and Antonio's heart pounded in his chest as he moved with the rhythm of battle. He knew the stakes. He knew that this could be the moment that decided everything. He couldn't afford to fail. He wouldn't. As the fight raged on, Antonio's mind flickered back to the truth he had learned. The truth about his father's deals, his family's dark past. He had been given a choice, a chance to either continue the legacy or tear it down. And now, standing on the battlefield, he realized something. The truth was not just about uncovering secrets. It was about making a choice. A choice to be the man he wanted to be, not the man his father had shaped him to be. The last of Petrov's men fell to the ground, and the compound was silent once more. Antonio stood in the center of the chaos, his chest heaving, his mind racing. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. He had done what he set out to do, but the question still remained. What now? The truth was still out there, buried deep, and Antonio knew that he would have to keep digging if he wanted to survive the storm that was coming. The family's future was in his hands now, and with it, the power to either break free from the past or be swallowed by it. The choice was his. The victory at Petrov's compound was short-lived. Though Antonio and his men had successfully taken control of the estate, the weight of the battle still pressed heavily on his chest. The gunfire, the blood, the chaos. It was all a reminder that this wasn't just about taking power. It was about survival. And survival in the world he had inherited was never as simple as winning a battle. Antonio stood in the aftermath, his thoughts a whirlwind. Petrov's men were down, but the man himself had slipped away, disappeared into the shadows. Antonio had been so close. Yet now, Petrov's elusive presence hung over him like a dark cloud. The compound was silent now, save for the distant sound of sirens and the soft shuffle of his men securing the area. Antonio turned to Vito, his trusted right-hand man, who had stayed by his side through it all. "Petrov's still out there," Antonio said, his voice rough. "We can't let him slip away again. This is our chance to end it." Vito nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "We'll find him, boss. We always do." But Antonio knew it wasn't that simple. The battle had been won, yes, but the war was far from over. Petrov wasn't just another rival in their world of crime. He was a force to be reckoned with, a man whose reach extended far beyond what Antonio had initially realized. The Romano family had always operated with ruthless efficiency, but Petrov had a network, an empire of his own, and he wasn't the kind to give up without a fight. Antonio's mind raced as he walked through the compound, looking for anything that could lead him to Petrov. His men had already started collecting intel, searching through the offices and the few remaining documents they had found. But Antonio's gut told him it wouldn't be enough. He had to get inside Petrov's head. He had to understand how the man thought, how he moved. That was the only way he would be able to bring him down. As Antonio walked, his thoughts turned back to the stranger, the man who had shown him the truth about his family's past. The truth that had been buried for so long. What had that man meant when he said, "You're finally ready to dig it up"? Antonio had always known that there were dark secrets about his father, about his family's rise to power. But the idea that those secrets were tied to Petrov, to the deals and sacrifices made years ago, was more than Antonio had bargained for. And now, those secrets were threatening to destroy everything he had worked for. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let the truth, whatever it was, tear apart the family he had spent his life protecting. "We need to move fast," Antonio said, turning to Vito. "Petrov's people will be looking for revenge. We can't afford to wait. We hit him hard, now, before he has the chance to regroup." Vito nodded, his expression hardening. "We'll mobilize the men. Where do we start?" Antonio looked out at the compound, his gaze focused and intense. "We start by going after everything Petrov holds dear. His assets, his businesses, his people. We hit him where it hurts." The plan was simple, but the execution would be anything but easy. Petrov had connections everywhere. He was a man with power, resources, and a network that spanned the globe. Antonio knew he would have to be ruthless if he wanted to defeat him. There was no room for mercy. But as the days passed, Antonio's resolve grew stronger. He wasn't just fighting for his family's survival anymore. He was fighting for his own identity, for the man he wanted to be. And that meant facing the truth about his family, about his father, and about everything they had built. The more he uncovered, the more Antonio realized that Petrov wasn't just a businessman. He was a ghost from the past, a part of the legacy Antonio had inherited, whether he liked it or not. As Antonio and his men closed in on Petrov's operations, the tension continued to rise. The final confrontation was inevitable. Antonio knew that the truth he had been searching for would come to light soon, whether he was ready for it or not. But he couldn't afford to be afraid. He had made his choice, and now he had to see it through. Petrov's empire was crumbling, but it wasn't just about power. It was about redemption. And for Antonio, redemption meant confronting the darkest parts of his family's history. He wasn't just going to survive this. He was going to take control. As the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Antonio stood at the edge of a precipice. He could feel the weight of the moment, the decision that would define the rest of his life. The battle wasn't just against Petrov anymore. It was against the legacy his father had left him. It was a battle for truth, for honor, and for the future of the Romano family. And Antonio was ready to fight with everything he had. Antonio stared at the empty office, his hand gripping the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. The war with Petrov was escalating faster than he anticipated, but there was something else gnawing at him, something that had been haunting him since the night he discovered the truth about his father. The more Antonio dug, the deeper the hole seemed to get, and the closer he came to realizing that his family's empire wasn't just built on bloodshed. It was built on a chain of decisions that were slowly destroying it. He had always believed in the family's honor, in the idea that the Romano name stood for something solid, something unshakable. But now, with every piece of the puzzle falling into place, Antonio realized just how fragile that foundation was. He needed to confront Petrov, yes, but he also had to confront himself, his father's legacy, and the truth that had been buried for far too long. As Antonio paced the room, the door swung open, and Vito entered, his face as unreadable as always. He was holding a file, and Antonio could tell by the way he was holding it that something serious had come up. "What is it?" Antonio asked, his voice cold. Vito handed him the file without a word, and Antonio opened it. Inside were documents, photographs, and a list of names, all tied to Petrov's operations, his family, and a few familiar faces Antonio never thought he'd see again. Among the names were high-ranking officials, business partners, and even a few well-known public figures who had ties to his father's dealings with Petrov. Antonio's eyes narrowed. "So it's true," he muttered. "Petrov's reach is deeper than I thought. He's been buying people off for years. And I'm just finding out about it now." Vito nodded. "We've been too focused on the fights we can see, boss. Petrov has been playing the long game, and it's not just about us. It's about his entire network. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Antonio slammed the file shut. "What I should have done a long time ago. We go after his people. We take away his power." Vito didn't flinch. "And what about the family? What about the truth you've uncovered? You can't ignore that, Antonio. You've been digging for answers, and now you've found them." Antonio looked up at Vito, his expression hard. "The truth won't save us. But destroying Petrov and his empire will. That's what matters right now." Vito stepped closer, his voice lowering. "But the truth, boss, it's still there. It's still waiting to catch up with you." Antonio turned away, his gaze drifting to the window. He could feel the weight of Vito's words pressing on him. He had pushed the truth aside for too long, but now, with Petrov's empire closing in, he knew he couldn't escape it forever. The choices his father had made, the deals with men like Petrov, they weren't just about business. They were about loyalty, power, and survival. And now, Antonio was trapped in the same web. He had inherited it all, and now, he had to deal with the consequences. He couldn't let his father's mistakes define him, but he couldn't ignore them either. "We do this my way," Antonio said, his voice final. "We take down Petrov, but we do it clean. No more lies. No more secrets. We end this, and we rebuild. But we don't make the same mistakes as my father." Vito didn't argue. He understood what Antonio meant. This wasn't just about taking control of the streets. It was about reclaiming the future, about making the right choices, and about rebuilding a legacy that had been tarnished by the past. As Antonio looked out over the city, he knew this wasn't just the end of a war. It was the beginning of something else. He had no illusions about what the future held. The truth would come out, and Petrov wasn't the only enemy Antonio had to face. The battle for control of the Romano family's empire had always been about more than just money and power. It had always been about survival. And Antonio wasn't going to let anything or anyone take that from him. The path ahead was uncertain, and the stakes were higher than ever. But Antonio knew one thing for sure. He couldn't afford to lose. As the sun began to set, Antonio gathered his men once again. This time, they weren't just preparing for a fight. They were preparing for the end of an era. Petrov had no idea what was coming, but Antonio was ready. The time had come to face the truth, to confront the past, and to take back everything that had been stolen. And Antonio was ready to lead the charge. Antonio stood at the edge of the Romano family estate, staring into the darkness as the night settled in. The weight of the coming confrontation with Petrov hung heavy in the air, but something else gnawed at him. A deeper question that had been simmering since he first uncovered the truth about his father's legacy. Petrov was a dangerous man, a man who had caused enough bloodshed and chaos. But Antonio now knew that the real battle wasn't just about taking down Petrov's empire. It was about facing the reality of the Romano family's past and the role his father played in building that empire. The truth was ugly, and Antonio had spent his entire life trying to shield himself from it, trying to live in the image of the strong leader his father had been. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized that his father wasn't the man Antonio had admired. His father had made deals with men like Petrov, sold parts of their soul for the sake of power, and kept secrets that were now coming to light. And Antonio had inherited it all, the empire, the secrets, the power. But now, he had to decide what kind of man he was going to be. As he walked back into the estate, his thoughts were interrupted by Vito's voice. "Boss, we've got trouble. Petrov's men are gathering. They're preparing to make their move." Antonio's chest tightened. The war wasn't over. It was only just beginning. He had hoped for more time to prepare, to uncover more about his father's deals with Petrov and the truth behind the family's rise to power. But now time had run out. "Get the men ready," Antonio said, his voice sharp. "We strike first. We don't wait for them to come to us." Vito nodded and hurried out, but Antonio remained still, his mind racing. This wasn't just about defending their territory. It wasn't even about protecting the family's power. It was about something much more personal. Petrov had to pay for the damage he had done, but Antonio also needed to confront the man he had been raised to be and the truth about the family he had sworn to protect. As Antonio stood in the silence of his office, he couldn't help but think about the stranger, the man who had revealed the truth to him. The man had shown him the photograph of Sofia Romano, his father's first love, and had spoken of the blood debts that had been paid to secure the family's power. The man had promised Antonio that the truth would come for him, and Antonio knew now that it had. The family was built on a foundation of lies, and the only way to rebuild it was to face the past. Petrov, his father's deal with him, and everything that had been sacrificed to create the Romano Empire. It all had to be confronted. Antonio wasn't sure if he was ready for the truth, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't run from it any longer. His father had made a pact with a man like Petrov, and now, Antonio had to decide if he would honor that pact or destroy it. The clock was ticking, and the battle for the family's future was about to begin. Antonio gathered his men again, his voice steady as he addressed them. "We don't just fight for our survival. We fight for the truth. We fight to take control of this family's destiny." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was no response. But then, one by one, the men nodded, their eyes steely with determination. The family would fight, not just for their name, but for what they truly stood for. They would face Petrov head-on, but they would also face the truth about the choices that had brought them here. As they prepared to move out, Antonio's thoughts turned back to the stranger. The man had said that the truth was buried deep, but Antonio had already begun to dig. He had learned about his father's betrayals, about the bloodshed that had been used to build the family's empire. And now, it was time to finish what he had started. The truth was waiting for him, and he had no choice but to face it. As they moved out toward Petrov's compound, Antonio's heart beat faster, not just from the adrenaline of the coming fight, but from the weight of the decisions he had to make. Petrov had no idea what was coming for him, and neither did Antonio. But one thing was clear. This was no longer just about taking down a rival. It was about taking control of his own destiny. and Antonio Romano was ready to do whatever it took to secure the future of his family, even if it meant destroying the past. The night was still, almost unnervingly so, as Antonio and his men approached the outskirts of Petrov's compound. The adrenaline that had driven him just hours ago had now settled into a cold resolve. This was no longer about defending his empire. It was about something far deeper. He had spent his whole life in the shadow of the Romano family name, believing in the legacy of power and respect his father had built. But now, everything was in question. The truth about his father's dealings with Petrov, the deals made in darkness, the blood spilled to secure their place at the top, all of it haunted Antonio like a specter. As they drove closer, Antonio's thoughts kept returning to the photograph of Sofia Romano, the woman who had been killed because she knew too much. The woman who was tied to his father's past in a way that was still unclear. She was not just a victim of Petrov's reach, but of the lies his father had built. His empire on. And Antonio realized, as the compound loomed larger in front of him, that if he wanted to truly change the fate of his family, he would have to face the reality of everything they had done to get here. There was no more room for denial, no more space for the illusion of honor. This fight, this war with Petrov, wasn't just about power or survival. It was about confronting the past and forging a future on a different foundation, one built on truth. As the convoy of cars pulled up to the compound gates, Antonio's mind sharpened. There would be no negotiating with Petrov this time. No more subtle moves or hidden alliances. This was war. The gates opened, and Antonio and his men stepped out, ready for what was to come. The compound, though grand and fortified, stood silent. It felt like the calm before a storm. Antonio knew Petrov would be expecting a fight, but he also knew that Petrov had underestimated him. This wasn't just a business deal anymore. It was personal. As Antonio and his men advanced, they moved with calculated precision. Every step was purposeful, every move was planned. Antonio had spent years building this family's power, but now, with the truth weighing heavy on his shoulders, he understood that the only way forward was to tear down the old and rebuild something new. They reached the main building, the walls fortified with guards and surveillance. Antonio's heart pounded in his chest as he prepared for the confrontation. The door opened before they could reach it, and there stood Petrov, flanked by two of his men. He was calm, almost too calm, and the cold smile on his face told Antonio everything he needed to know. Petrov wasn't just expecting a fight. He was ready for it. "So, we finally meet," Petrov said, his voice smooth, tinged with amusement. "I've been waiting for this moment." Antonio stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Petrov. "This ends today, Petrov," he said, his voice steady and full of determination. "No more games. No more deals. You're going to pay for everything you've done to my family." Petrov's smile didn't falter. "Your family? You still believe you're fighting for them?" The words hit Antonio like a physical blow. He hadn't expected Petrov to know so much. But then again, Petrov knew everything. He had been in the shadows for so long, pulling strings, making moves while Antonio's father had been too focused on maintaining control to see the true threat. "You've been living in the past, Antonio," Petrov continued, his voice now laced with disdain. "You think this is about the past, about your father's mistakes. But it's not. It's about power, and you're not ready for it." Antonio felt a surge of anger, but he kept it under control. Petrov was right about one thing. It wasn't just about his father. It was about Antonio, about what kind of man he would be moving forward. He had a choice now. A choice to let the past define him, or to make his own future. "This is where your empire ends," Antonio said, his voice cold as ice. "I won't let you destroy my family any longer." Petrov chuckled, stepping closer. "You think you can just take everything I've built, Antonio? You think you're the one who gets to decide who survives?" Antonio didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I don't just think it. I know it." With a single motion, Antonio signaled for his men to move in. The tension in the air broke like a dam, and the fight erupted. Gunfire rang out, loud and deafening, echoing through the compound. Antonio and his men moved swiftly, taking down Petrov's guards one by one, their movements coordinated and precise. But through the chaos, Antonio's mind remained focused on the task at hand, taking down Petrov and ending this war once and for all. He had no illusions about what this meant. This fight, this war, wasn't just for survival. It was for redemption, for the chance to rebuild his family, to break free from the past that had shackled them for so long. As Antonio and Petrov finally faced off, the tension between them was palpable. Antonio's heart raced, not from fear, but from the raw emotion of everything he had been fighting for. This wasn't just about the Romano name anymore. This was about his own future, and he was ready to take control. With a final, swift move, Antonio took down Petrov's remaining men. The compound fell silent, and Petrov, now cornered, looked at Antonio with a mixture of shock and admiration. "You really think you've won?" Petrov asked, his voice hoarse. Antonio didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, knowing that the final choice had been made. The truth was out, and there was no turning back now. This was the beginning of a new chapter for Antonio Romano, and he was determined to write it his way. The dust had barely settled after the fierce battle at Petrov's compound. Antonio stood in the heart of the wreckage, his mind still processing the events that had unfolded. Petrov, the man who had been a ghost for so long, the shadow looming over the Romano family's empire, was gone. But the victory felt hollow. Petrov's empire had been dismantled, his men taken down one by one. But the truth that had been buried for so long was now out in the open. Antonio felt the weight of the revelation press down on him, a burden he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. The truth about his father's deals with Petrov, the bloodshed that had fueled their rise to power, and the legacy that had been built on a foundation of lies. It was all inescapable now. Antonio had won, yes. He had taken control of his family's future, but at what cost? The past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how hard you tried to run from it. "It's over," Antonio muttered to himself, his voice hollow. He stood alone, the echo of the words sinking in. But as the silence surrounded him, the weight of the moment began to feel more like a beginning than an end. The Romano name was no longer just a symbol of power. It was now a symbol of survival, of a legacy that had been forever altered. Antonio's thoughts were interrupted as Vito walked up beside him. His old friend had seen the transformation in Antonio, seen the way the weight of the truth had shifted him. Vito was the first to speak. "What now, boss?" The question lingered in the air, hanging between them. What now? Antonio had spent his whole life building toward this moment. But now, with everything he had fought for crumbling around him, he had no answer. The fight had been for the family, for the future of the Romano name. But the reality was much different than he had expected. Petrov was gone, but the lies, the betrayals, they still haunted him. And the worst part? Antonio realized that the battle wasn't over. It wasn't even close. The truth had been revealed, but it had opened a whole new can of worms. His father's deals, his family's past, they weren't just going to vanish. The consequences of those choices would follow Antonio wherever he went. "We rebuild," Antonio said finally, his voice more determined than before. "We don't let Petrov's empire die in vain. We take control, but we do it on our terms. No more lies. No more deals in the dark. We start fresh." Vito nodded, but there was a question in his eyes. Antonio knew what he was thinking. "And what about the truth?" Vito asked. "What about everything your father did? Can you really rebuild with that hanging over your head?" Antonio looked out across the battlefield, the broken pieces of what was once Petrov's empire scattered around them. His eyes darkened. "We face it. We face it head on." The weight of his words wasn't lost on Vito. They both knew that facing the past wasn't going to be easy. It would tear through them, break them apart if they weren't careful. But Antonio had no choice. The truth had already shattered the world he thought he knew. There was no going back. "And what about the family?" Vito asked, his voice quieter now. "What about the people who will want to take what's left?" Antonio's jaw tightened. The family was fractured, no longer the unified force it once had been. There were factions, people with their own agendas, their own desires for power. And while Petrov's death had brought peace in one way, it had opened the door for others to make a move. "We hold the line," Antonio said firmly. "We show them that the Romano name isn't going anywhere. We rebuild, we unite, and we make sure that whoever tries to take our place will regret it." Vito nodded, understanding the resolve in Antonio's words. There would be no easy path forward. Antonio would have to fight not just to maintain power, but to redefine it. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Antonio felt like he had the control he needed. The truth was out, and now it was up to him to shape the future. But as Antonio turned to walk back into the estate, something stopped him. The image of Sofia Romano flashed in his mind again, the woman whose death had been a consequence of his father's choices. She wasn't just a casualty in a business deal. She was a part of the story that had shaped everything. And for the first time, Antonio realized that it wasn't just about power. It was about redemption. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. As the Romano family began to regroup, Antonio's mind was focused, his purpose clear. The family would not be defined by the mistakes of the past. They would write their own story, one of strength, truth, and survival. The battle was far from over, but Antonio was ready to face whatever came next. Antonio stood at the head of the Romano family's boardroom table, the weight of the decision he had just made settling on his shoulders. The tension that had once clung to him was now tempered by a sense of clarity. The past had caught up with him, and the truth about his father's empire was no longer a hidden burden, but an open wound that had to be healed. Petrov's downfall had been necessary, but it had only scratched the surface of what needed to be fixed. The remnants of the old empire, his father's choices, the sacrifices, the lies, were still present, still hovering over everything. Antonio's eyes flickered to the photograph of Sofia Romano, the woman whose death had been tied to his father's decisions. She was the symbol of everything that had gone wrong, everything that Antonio had yet to face. But now, for the first time, he understood what needed to be done. He had to break from the past completely. He could no longer operate under the shadow of his father's choices. It was time to create something new, something built on the truth and not on the remnants of old lies. "We rebuild," Antonio said aloud, his voice firm, and it echoed through the room. His lieutenants, the men and women who had stood by him through the chaos, looked to him with expectation. No more hiding behind the Romano name. Antonio continued. "We're not just rebuilding our empire. We're rebuilding who we are. Our family's future depends on the choices we make now. We stop making deals in the dark. No more sacrifices." Vito, his right-hand man, stepped forward, a look of concern etched across his face. "Boss, you're talking about a complete overhaul. The men who fought for us, the power we've built, it's not going to come without a cost." Antonio's gaze hardened. "It's a cost we've already paid, Vito. I've seen enough. This empire, what's left of it, needs a foundation of truth, not the lies we've been living under. The family needs to see this, too. We can't move forward without confronting the past." The room fell silent. The weight of Antonio's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. For years, they had operated in the shadows, but now, Antonio was setting a course for a future where transparency and loyalty mattered more than secrecy and control. Vito nodded slowly, understanding Antonio's resolve. "All right, boss. If you say this is the way forward, we'll follow." Antonio appreciated Vito's loyalty, but he knew this wasn't just about loyalty to him. It was about loyalty to the family, to the future of the Romano name. "Gather the others," Antonio instructed. "We start with the truth. We tell them everything. No more hiding. No more secrets. This family will be built on honesty, no matter the cost." As the family gathered, Antonio felt the eyes of his relatives on him. He could sense their fear, their uncertainty. They had followed his father's legacy, built their lives on the power and money that came with it. But now, Antonio was asking them to change everything, to face the truth about who they were and what they had become. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward. Antonio stood before them, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. He had no illusions about what would happen next. Some would accept the truth, others would resist. But he couldn't go back. "I've spent my life running from the truth," Antonio began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've hidden behind the name Romano, behind my father's choices. But I can't do that anymore. Our family, our legacy, is more than just power and money. It's about who we are and what we stand for. And we're going to rebuild that from the ground up. The truth will be the foundation of everything we do from now on. No more lies. No more deals made in the shadows." The room was still. Then, one by one, Antonio's family members began to speak. Some, like Luca, his cousin, were skeptical, questioning whether they could really turn away from the power they had fought so hard for. But there were others, Marco, his uncle Matteo, who understood. They had lived through the lies, and they knew the only way to move forward was to tear down the old structure and build something new. It was a hard choice, but it was the right one. And for the first time in his life, Antonio felt the weight of responsibility and leadership settle fully on his shoulders. "This is just the beginning," Antonio said, his voice steady as he looked around the room. "We've won this battle, but the war isn't over. We have enemies, people who want to take us down, people who will try to exploit our weakness. But if we stand together, if we face the truth, we can overcome anything." As the family began to unite under his leadership, Antonio knew that this wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. The battle with Petrov had been the spark that ignited the fire, but the real work was ahead. They would have to rebuild the Romano Empire from the ground up, and this time, it would be done on their terms. The future was uncertain, but Antonio was ready. The truth had set him free from the shackles of his past, and now he would lead the Romano family into a new era, one built on honesty, loyalty, and strength. And for the first time in years, Antonio felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had chosen the right path. This story follows Antonio Romano, a Mafia heir forced to confront buried truths about his family legacy as he uncovers lies, betrayal, and the dark origins of his power. Blending suspense, emotional tension, and the intensity of dark romance, the narrative explores how Antonio confronts the shadow of his father's choices while battling a ruthless enemy named Petrov. As secrets about forbidden love, hidden alliances, and long-buried sins come to light, Antonio must redefine what loyalty and honor truly mean. Filled with atmospheric tension and the dangerous pull of dark romance, this story dives deep into identity, redemption, and the cost of power. It captures the emotional complexity of a man torn between avenging his family and reshaping its future, all while navigating the haunting edge of dark romance that surrounds his past. With shifting loyalties, shocking revelations, and the gritty beauty of underworld conflict, this gripping narrative is perfect for fans of powerful storytelling woven with the irresistible undertones of dark romance.